months in advance. Phil Mercer for CBC News.
Well, the U.S. Coast Guard is still pursuing an oil tanker in international waters near Venezuela.
今天准备去那儿？先去
Karen Pauls reports.
那个叫哪儿啊？先去那个 Shelburne 和粪区之间那个park 里边转一圈，转个2个小时，这是咱最享受的地方。然后再去买点东西啊啥的，准备过节。
Well, this is part of what President Trump has declared as a full naval blockade of Venezuela, which is an act of war. So
Ben Rosewell is a former Canadian ambassador to Venezuela. He believes Trump's goal is to ultimately put the U.S. in control of the entire continent.
I think they've chosen Venezuela because it's the weakest country that it could have this show of force to demonstrate to all the other countries, the Americans, watch out, we can do this to Venezuela. We could potentially do this to you as well.
Karen Pauls, CBC News, Washington.
Now to Moscow.
Продолжается осмотр места происшествия. Следствием будут назначены необходимые...
That is a Russian official announcing an investigation into a car bombing that has claimed the life of a senior member of the Russian military. Lieutenant Fanil Sarorov was killed this morning after an explosive device was detonated on his vehicle. The Kremlin says it is investigating a theory that Ukrainian intelligence was involved. At this point, there's been no comment from Kyiv. That is the CBC News from Toronto. I'm Nicole Martin. This is CBC Radio 1, 99.1. Here's the weather forecast for Toronto, Hamilton, and Niagara. Sunny with increasing cloudiness today. A chance of flurries this afternoon. A high of 2 degrees, feeling like -14 with the wind chill. A chance of flurries this evening. Snow beginning overnight. Temperature steady near 1 degree. Tomorrow, risk of freezing drizzle in the morning and a high of 5 degrees. For Peterborough and the Kawarthas, a chance of flurries this morning with the risk of freezing drizzle. A high of 0 today. We'll see snow beginning late this evening. A low of -2 overnight. Tomorrow, snow changing to periods of rain or drizzle and a high of 3 degrees.
It is the end of the year, and that means we get to look back on some of the conversations that we've had this year that shed the light on how we see the world and the artists who are making a difference. Kent Monkman is an Indigenous artist who's made it his life's work to correct the record and subvert what is commonly accepted. I'm Alamin Abdul Mahmoud, and this is Commotion. Earlier this year, I spoke with Riley S. Snow, Susan Blight, and Marion Newman. And before we get to that conversation, I just want to maybe set the stage for you just a little bit so I can tell you who Kent Monkman is. For decades, Kent Monkman has been challenging the representation of Indigenous people in Western art. He's been reimagining historical events from an Indigenous perspective, and he's done this through these massive, super realistic paintings, also installations and sculptures and books, and through this alter ego that he has, a two-spirit figure. Her name is Miss Chief Eagle Testicle, who's featured in parts of an opera that was staged earlier this year. So what you're going to hear right now is a conversation with Riley and Susan and Marion, and I should tell you that when we recorded this conversation, Marion Newman was about to take the stage in Montreal as Miss Chief for the very first time. So you'll hear what that meant to her. But the conversation started off when I asked Susan Blight to describe one of Kent's paintings.
I mean, he has a wide-ranging practice, but I think that, and it may be a very expected response, but when I think about his work and the power of his work and the impact of his work, I think a lot about the screen. This is a painting a lot of us are probably familiar with.
Yeah.
But it is also an image, I think, that has multiple layers. On the one hand, it's Kent sort of intervening and interrogating a medium that has historically, until very recently, held Indigenous people as subjects, not as creators. We are some of the most painted or photographed people in the world, but until very recently didn't have the institutional power to make those images of ourselves. So those images become misrepresentations, that were depicted through a colonial or imperial lens and results in exoticizing and fetishizing our images. And I think that Kent sort of plays with that medium a little bit. And so there's that idea, right, of making space into an arena that is historically not had space for us, except in a very specific way, through a non-Indigenous lens. The other thing is that the other level here, I think, is of course, what the image is depicting, right? children being torn, ripped from their parents' arms, kidnapped by uniformed police, RCMP and priests and nuns. It's a very intense, visceral image. If we think about the, with the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the images that sort of stand in our minds of that time, the images are often institutional images of children standing in rows with priests and nuns, praying beside the bed, in classrooms, in rows. This image is one of the first images I think we've seen of that actual moment, that moment of children being ripped from their parents. It depicts the violence of that moment in a very intense and real way. And so that specific violence that the screen, I think, represents and through its representation and its size, right? They're very monumental paintings.
They're gigantic paintings, yes.
Yeah, I think really calls viewers to be witnesses
I
to
think
this history.
The description of visceral is exactly correct. I think you see that image and you can't help but sort of step into the feelings that you're sort of seeing depicted. And it's incredibly sort of powerful reaction. Riley, what about you? Which images come to mind for you? What's the thing that makes those images powerful?
I mean, there are so many. I'm thinking about, The Scream. I'm thinking about, his Indigenous matriarch series that he did, portraits of Indigenous matriarchs. But the ones that I really love, especially topically, are those series of Mischief. And I love that, in that series of paintings, he's still talking often about colonial history, but instead of using the very, again, visceral, dramatic violence that you'd see in other works of his, like The Scream, humor is kind of like the doorway into the narrative, right? And flipping a lot of these colonial narratives on its head. I'm thinking of, where Indigenous people have been and Indigenous women and femmes and queers especially have been, exoticized and made into these objects. He flips it, and I'm thinking of The Daddies is one on the top of my head right now, right? Where it's Mischief looking at the fathers of Confederation, and she's laying into them. And so it's funny to look at.